Okay, welcome everyone to this session of Tea Fun. My name's Louise Taylor. I'm a Professor of Education and Student Experience at Oxford Brookes University, and I'm delighted to host this session. And I want to give a really warm welcome to Jenny Taylorson, who's going to be talking to us today. Um, just hang on a moment. I've lost my other screen. Hang on. Where's it gone? This isn't very slick. I've just lost I've just lost the screen. Oh, there it is. Okay. Lost the tab I was on. Jenny is an education focused lecturer at the University of St Andrews. She's the director of teaching at the International Education and Lifelong Learning Institute. And her research is grounded in the social identity approach, and focuses on understanding educator identities in higher education, with a focus particularly on how teaching-focused academics construct and negotiate their professional identities in research-intensive institutions. So I think this is a topic that speaks to many TFUnners, and I'm delighted to hand over to Jenny.
Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you all for attending this seminar on the ideologies that sustain and challenge the teaching research hierarchy. What I'm going to present today is actually the fourth and final project of my PhD. During my PhD journey, if I can call it that, I kind of started off by looking at English for academic purposes lecturers' collective identity in higher education. And then I sort of moved over a little bit and I became quite interested in looking at education-focused academic identity development. And so I created a qualitative model of education-focused identity professional development when people moved into education-focused roles. I've done a couple of other things. I've got a colleague present here at the moment, Amritesh Singh. We're doing a duo autoethnography related to our academic identities. I've done a bit of autoethnography and a bit of stuff in international education, but this is sort of the culmination of my PhD work. And it is in fact the only paper thus far that has not been through the peer review process. So hopefully the discussions that we'll have about the data will be interesting to you, but also potentially useful to me as well. Okay, so I'd like to talk through a little bit about the study itself before we sort of look at some of the data associated with the study and kind of get into maybe interpreting that together and discussing its implications. So the research question that sort of shaped this element of my PhD, this project, was what ideologies sustain and challenge the teaching research hierarchy? In terms of what I mean by ideology, I've taken a social psychological approach to this, grounded in the social identity approach. And so I see ideologies as being the values and beliefs shared by a social group. And these are the social basis for how groups are defined and distinguished from other relevant groups. Importantly, for the questions I had around, the teaching research hierarchy, ideologies play a large part in shaping the social relations between subgroups within a particular context. Obviously, within this context, higher education. And I think also quite importantly, they act as mechanisms that sort of narrow the range of legitimate questions that we can pose and answer within a social space. So this is what I mean when I say ideology within the context of this study. In terms of the methodology, I took a constructivist grounded theory approach, and that was sort of grounded more broadly in ethnography, as I'm a participant, a member of this community that I'm interested in. And as constructivist grounded theory lies quite squarely in the field of interpretivism, I do think it might be useful just to briefly talk about my background and how I came to sort of ask these questions about educator identities in higher education, because this background has shaped both the questions I've asked and also the way that I've approached the data. So I've been an educator for about 25 years now. I feel very old, very old to be doing a PhD anyway. And came into higher education about 8 years ago. And prior to coming into higher education in the UK, I'd worked mainly in international education in the Middle East, and I'd done various jobs out there. I'd been a content and language integrated learning advisor on a school improvement project in Abu Dhabi. And most latterly, I'd been part of a management team working with a university in Riyadh, and we set up a foundation program, a preparatory year program for 12,000 female students. And so sort of coming back to the UK, I felt that I had quite an established professional identity, and I felt quite confident in that identity. And I think probably quite naively, I thought that moving into higher education, I was continuing an already established career. And I think probably what I found over time was that educator identity was just one portion of academic identity. And for some, not even the most central or important element of academic identity. And so these sort of realizations as I moved through this space over the last 8 years have sort of led me to ask these questions about educator identities in higher education. I think the important thing to note here is that within the constructivist grounded theory tradition, the idea is not to leave your lived experiences at the door, or your disciplinary understandings at the door of analysis. It's more that you recognize them and you do your best to try and see past yourself where possible. So I'll talk about that just a little bit more in a moment when we have a look at the analysis. In terms of data collection, data was collected through semi-structured interviews that were done online through Teams. There were 2 rounds of data collection. In the first round, I was looking for quite broad, it was quite inclusive. So academics on a range of different contract types were welcome to participate as long as they were engaged in some form of teaching. So that resulted in PhD students participating, people on research-only contracts, education and research people, education-focused, and also those from the third space, so quite broad. In round 2, I sort of targeted, moved in and looked specifically at education-focused and third space colleagues as participants. In terms of the focus of the interviews, we talked about career trajectories, teaching practices, professional development, beliefs about learning and teaching, and also beliefs about the purposes of higher education. In terms of the sample, we had 44 participants in total, 27 identified as male, with 17 identifying as female. There was a range of those with different career stages, as I mentioned, PhD students up to professor, although there was a skew towards more senior staff. I think quite interestingly, in terms of the sample, the majority, 36 out of the 44, had some form of learning to teach professional development experience, whether that was sort of enrolling in something that was a bit more structured and sort of resulted in a PG Cert or a PG Cap or something like that, or kind of in-house training. In terms of disciplinary spreads, we had 22 disciplines represented, and in terms of teaching experience, we had sort of 6 months up to over 20 years, again with that skew towards more experience. Briefly, and I know I want to leave time to actually discuss things, but I think it's important just to outline things, especially as a PhD student. I have found reading published work, particularly qualitative work, data analysis is often something kind of glossed over. And so just in case anybody's interested in constructivist grounded theory and hasn't done it before, I do want to just outline the analytical processes I went through looking at this data. So the first thing to say is that I kind of employed theoretical sampling. So this means that I was collecting data and at the same time analysing data. So I do an interview, transcribe it, and then start analysing it as I was then also interviewing the next participant. And the purpose of this is to allow those insights of engaging with the data to inform kind of further sampling decisions. In terms of the analytical processes themselves, the first stage was initial coding. And so this is really sort of where the groundedness of grounded theory comes from. So the idea is that you stay very close to the data. We're not trying to make big conceptual leaps at this point. So we're looking at participants' accounts of actions and processes. And in fact, where possible, in the naming of codes, we're also trying to use action words, verbs, and gerunds to capture that sort of kind of action in the data. In terms of this particular study, I used incident to incident coding rather than word to word or line by line coding. I then moved into focused coding, which is where we're synthesizing those initial codes into sort of more abstract categories, in this case, into these ideologies. And in that process, we're sort of asking questions about which codes are more frequent, which are going to be more analytically useful and maybe tell a more conceptually powerful story of the data. And this wasn't sort of a linear process, as the slide suggests. There's sort of lots of back and forth. And alongside that, we're sort of memoing, keeping track of, thinking at different points in time, and sort of making sure that we're keeping a record of that. The next stage of analysis was the theoretical integration. And this involved sort of examining the relationships between the ideologies. And in particular, I was interested in the ideologies' sort of mechanisms of operation, their consequences for academic and educator identities, and their impact on the relationship between subgroups within the context of higher education. And one of the first things I did in this process was to create a diagram pretty much for myself, but I will share that with you in a moment. It looks quite complicated, just trying to capture how I thought these ideologies interacted with one another. As a kind of fifth element here, I also subsequently used the social identity approach theory from the social identity approach as a further interpretive lens, but it wasn't used as an a priori coding framework. Finally, just returning to this idea of interpretivism, I was keen to sort of ensure that throughout this process, there were mechanisms to ensure reflexivity. And so I think one of the key things that was really, really helpful was kind of engaging with my supervisors on a regular basis and having quite robust discussions about data items. They didn't always agree with my interpretation. It was really good because it gave me the opportunity to think in a different way and think past myself at various points. The other thing that I was doing at the same time as analysing this data, as I've mentioned before, was engaging in autoethnography. And again, that sort of gave me an opportunity to maybe see how I was understanding the data and again, sort of maybe see past that in some regards. So that's it about the study. Let's sort of address the what I'm thinking of as the elephant in the room. So within my research question, there is the inherent assumption that there is a teaching research hierarchy, but is there? So what I'd like you to do first, if that's okay, just to sort of gauge where we're at and what we all think. I've got a QR code here. It takes you to a one-item survey, and I'm asking, do you think there is a teaching research hierarchy in higher education? And I'm defining the teaching research hierarchy as research being typically valued more highly than teaching in terms of status, recognition, and career progression. So I'm just going to click out of the slides for a minute, and I'm going to go to the survey itself, and we will have a look at responses as they come in. So I think we've got a few. There were 4 before this group did it. I did it with another group. So let's have a look. Is everybody seeing my screen now?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so we've got a couple of maybes, and the majority is yes. But as I said, there were people who did this before, and all 4 of those people had said yes. So okay, this is good. This is an interesting starting point. Let's see where we go from here. Okay, let me just pop this back on. Okay, so what makes you think that there is or maybe isn't a teaching research hierarchy? Are there any sort of lived experiences that you've had, any sort of sense of this? Louise, if you wouldn't mind sort of taking raised hands if people want to share, or if there's anything in the chat, that would be fabulous.
Sure. Do people want to write anything in the chat, or you can just raise your hand? I'll just start anecdotally. I think, yes, I've just seen Jackie's put lack of funding. That's true. Lack of funding for teaching focused research, I guess is what you mean, Jackie. Um, Educators who are teaching focused feel they kind of, I've heard them talk about kind of feeling like they're the general dog's body. They kind of get given all the extra tasks, like a lot of the student support and academic advising. Um, and not the researchers, suggesting that the research is more prioritized.
It's quite an interesting thing there. So that's sort of actually distinguishing between two types of research. So disciplinary research and subtle or education focused research. So I think that's quite an interesting comment there that we might sort of come back to a bit later. Okay. If there aren't any more comments, I'll kind of move on, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity later to unpack some of that a bit. Okay, so yes, I think it would be fair to say that within the literature, there is a recognition of a teaching research hierarchy. These are some of the publications that I think are most appropriate to sort of answering this question, is there a teaching research hierarchy? I think one of the things to note here is that a lot of these papers that I've got on this slide are talking about, for example, how to embed reward and recognition in learning and teaching. Rebalancing promotion in higher education. So whilst they might not be explicitly in titles saying that there is a teaching research hierarchy, the fact that we need to rebalance, or the fact that we need to embed reward and recognition in the domain of education, in itself, to me, is suggestive that there is a teaching research hierarchy. Some of these papers address this a little bit more head on. So my particular favourite here is You Certainly Don't Get Promoted for Just Teaching by Bull et al. So this is just a mere selection of some of the research that does address this teaching research hierarchy. So yeah, as I say, I think it would be fair to say that I think it probably does in various forms.
So Jenny, in the chat, we've just got another comment or two. A couple of people saying that, echoing Katie's comment, that she's heard people not being told not to apply for teaching and scholarship roles as it will kill their career.
Yes. Yes, there's lots of evidence like that in the data, and it's a bit heartbreaking. We'll see in a moment, one particular participant was told by her research-focused colleagues that her presence demeaned the university as she was an education-focused academic. So yes, unfortunately, there is evidence of this type of thing within the data as well. Okay, so turning to the data itself, this was one of the questions I had for the data. So does this teaching research hierarchy exist? And so 38 of the 44 participants do describe this hierarchy, mainly in terms of the primacy of research. But note the title of the presentation or the talk today is The Ideologies that Sustain and Challenge the Teaching Research Hierarchy. 28 out of the 44 participants also reported a perceptible improvement in the value accorded to the work of educating, which for myself as an education-focused member of staff, I found quite encouraging. I don't know, I can't remember if I think I took the question out for time, but is this sort of ringing a chord with anybody? Does anybody here feel that maybe there are sort of steps towards a better valuing of education?
Yeah, definitely.
Could I say something here? Yes, I do still believe that there is a hierarchy and that research colleagues are sort of seen as being ahead of teaching focused colleagues. But I think as the financial outlook has changed in universities, and universities have expanded student numbers, and there's more of a priority on program teaching. I do think that's shifting. I still think that the traditional hierarchy is in place, but I think we're getting a little bit more legroom as educators.
Yes, I would say so too. Thank you. That's an interesting comment. I think it kind of speaks to one of the ideologies that does a bit of both of sustaining and challenging, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so let's have a look at the findings. So what I'm going to do is try and describe the ideologies overall, and then we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive, and I'm going to share some of the data with you specifically around the ideologies that sustain the hierarchy. And we'll see if there's time at the end to talk a little bit about some of the data associated with the disruptor ideologies, those that challenge the teaching research hierarchy. Louise, I've made a rookie error here. I've forgotten to bring my phone into the room, so I have absolutely no idea what the time is, so hopefully you'll keep me right.
Sure, I can let you know we're on 1:24.
Okay, fabulous. Right, let's see how far we get. Okay, so look, this is the diagram I told you about. It's a little bit complicated, I think. I might change it slightly in publication. But I think the thing to take away from this diagram really is that there are three types of ideologies in this hierarchy. There are the ones that challenge, the ones that sustain, and then there are the complicated ones that do a little bit of both in maybe slightly unexpected ways. So let's look first at the ideologies that sustain the teaching research hierarchy. So we've got prestige ideologies, as I'm calling them, and I'm calling them prestige ideologies because this is where prestige is located. And then we've got subordinate ideologies, which I'll come on to in a minute. So prestige ideologies include dominance of discipline, which I define as a belief that the most valuable form of knowledge is a deep specialism and a form of academic legitimacy and security. And two, the belief that the most important form of academic labour is generating new knowledge through research. And the second sort of element of that is life of the mind ideology. So this is another prestige ideology. And this is the belief in the intrinsic worth of intellectual endeavour, motivated by curiosity and a love of learning. And secondly, seeing oneself and other academics as intellectuals. And I might kind of do the quotation marks there, as intellectuals. What I kind of see in terms of these prestige ideologies is that they're sort of ideological orthodoxies. They're not inherently negative. There's a lot of positive things in here. It's great to have intrinsic motivation and a love of learning. That's a really positive thing. There's nothing wrong with seeing yourself as an intellectual, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to produce new knowledge. In fact, society really needs that. So these prestige ideologies, they're not inherently negative, but what they do is to sort of place our attention away from educating. And so we don't pay much attention to what education is, how we do it, and so on. So they sort of create the conditions for more sort of negative doing down perhaps of education. And so we see this more in the subordinate ideologies, and we've got two of these. So there's knowledge hierarchies, discipline over education, which I'm defining as the assumption that disciplinary epistemologies possess greater epistemic authority than educational epistemologies. And the second subordinate ideology is the feminization of teaching. And this is the ideological construction of educational labour as feminized labour, whereby teaching and pastoral work are positioned as secondary to masculinized forms of intellectual and disciplinary prestige. And this is sort of where I see these ideologies becoming a little bit more pernicious. So within the data, I should kind of make quite clear that not all participants had data coded into the subordinate ideologies. I see these ideologies as being more fundamentalist in nature. In other words, when you're part of a social group, you might well subscribe to the ideological orthodoxies of those groups, but you might not actually go down the line of becoming a bit more sort of radicalized or, subscribing to these more fundamentalist sort of ideologies. And so within these subordinate ideologies, this is sort of where education is being read through the disciplinary lens. Educational norms that don't align with this sort of orthodox script of how things should be done are actively being devalued or dismissed. So yeah, these are the ideologies that sort of sustain the hierarchy as far as I can see. In terms of the ideologies that challenge the teaching research hierarchy, we have two. So we've got people as a purpose, and I see this as being an orientation in which the value and purpose of higher education are located primarily in human development, relationality, and collective flourishing, rather than in individual prestige, disciplinary exceptionalism, or competitive knowledge production. Our other ideology that challenges the teaching research hierarchy is the universality of academic identity. And this is teaching and research being understood as inseparable and equally central to academic identity and practice. Now, in terms of the way in which these ideologies kind of challenge the teaching research hierarchy, I think there are two different social mechanisms going on. So if we have a look at the universality of academic identity, what we see here are kind of more prototypical members of the academic community. And what I mean by prototypical is that they have a foot in research. They are kind of demonstrating their ability to engage successfully with research, and therefore they are more prototypical. Therefore, they have more say, they have more voice. And so when members of the academic community who are engaging in research also say quite clearly, yes, but my identity is also formed of educator identity, and education is really important, and I want to do a good job, I want to learn about this. That's quite a powerful thing when, you know, these kind of prototypical members make that their identity and try and convince others potentially that that is what academic identity is all about. In terms of people as a purpose, I think there's a slightly different thing going on here. Within the data, it appears that most of this content, most of this ideology seems to be emerging from education-focused academics. Some of this is also coming from those who are education and research focused, but the majority of this content comes from people of the purpose, comes from education-focused academics. And I think this may be, and I may be stretching the data a little bit here, but this is my tentative interpretation. I think that there is a burgeoning sense of collective identity amongst education-focused academics. If we look at the HESA data, in 2023-2024, we have almost 50% of people responsible for teaching in the sector being on education-focused contracts. That is no longer a marginal group of people, and that has increased over the last 10 years by about 10 percentage points. Alongside that, we're seeing the birth of lots of communities like this one, Profs in Prep, we've got the Esotos network, we've got lots of kind of networks where we're sort of really putting forth education-focused practice and identity and news, I guess. So I think that maybe what's going on here in People as a Purpose is that there's a sense of advocacy going on, and that sort of comes up in the data later. Hopefully I'll get to it. It's right at the end of the presentation. But within People as a Purpose, there is a strand of data that is about advocacy. I've got to professor now, I have a voice, and therefore I want to make positive change around these values. So yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to ask any questions at this stage, or perhaps pop on to the next slide, I don't know.
Does anyone want to ask anything or put a question in the chat? I think it's really fascinating what you've got on this slide. I've got lots of comments that we can wait and discuss at the end. But yeah, the fact that we are here as TFUN, a teaching focused university network, is proof of what you're saying.
Potentially. I mean, at the moment it's anecdotal, but I think there's something in this, and it might be interesting to look at this in another study afterwards. Okay, I'll kind of go now to the third type of ideology, and it's the complicated case of neoliberalism. I'm not the first person to kind of note the complicated case of neoliberalism. If you look at kind of the work of Barnett 20 odd years ago, talking about super complexity within higher education, I think what I'm finding sort of mirrors that. But just to sort of outline that, neoliberalism both supports the prestige ideologies by intensifying the sort of the pressure to publish. So it intensifies the element of the prestige ideologies that are about knowledge production. So where you have this intrinsic love and need to produce new knowledge because you enjoy it and you're really committed to your discipline, what's happening with neoliberalism is that there's this extrinsic pressure now also being applied that sort of pushes you further down that rabbit hole, produce. So that sort of supports the hierarchy in that regard. However, equally, because we are now in this sort of neoliberal context where many institutions, at least at sort of a data level, a metric level, maybe think of students as consumers rather than as students per se. We've had to think a little bit more about education and educating. We've had to think about how do we satisfy customers? How do we ensure in this very diverse cohort that we have now, how do we ensure that everybody gets what they need? And so attention has had to be placed back on education. So we've taken some of that attention that has been given to the discipline, and we're actually saying, no, we need to think about how we do this. How do we educate? The other element of that is also that, as I mentioned a moment ago, we've got almost 50% of those engaged in teaching in the sector on education-focused contracts. And I think that in large part has probably come from this neoliberal context. We need more people to do the teaching. So yeah, neoliberalism sort of does a bit of both. It challenges, but it also sustains. Okay, so let's look a little bit more deeply. I'm going to share some of the data with you. As I mentioned, this paper has not been peer reviewed yet, so please do give me your commentary. I'll share the data with you, and then I think we can have a chat about maybe some of its implications. So we'll start off with the prestige ideology of life of the mind. And the first thing I want to kind of note is that within the data, I think there's evidence that life of the mind applies both into the sort of personal identity, but it's also relevant to the we, the kind of collective academic identity as well. So if we look first at the left-hand side of the slide and we look at work as a calling, not just a job, which, just as a reminder, is a belief in the intrinsic worth of intellectual endeavour motivated by curiosity and a love of learning. We've got participant 18 from round 1, and she's responding to a question I asked about how she got into academia. And so she responds, I was genuinely interested in the subject area. I didn't choose it instrumentally, thinking it would get me a job. So, as I say, it sort of speaks to that motivation, that internal curiosity and that intrinsic motivation. If we move across to the right-hand side of the slide, again, we've got an example here from participant 11 from round 1, and they're sort of taking this individual thing and applying it to a group. And she's saying here, we often do academic work during what many people, so that she's setting herself apart, or this group apart, academics from other people. We often do academic work during what many people would consider our free time. So for me, academic work has to be tied to doing something important, something I see as meaningful. If we have a look now at academic elitism, and we go back down to the left-hand side, the bottom of the left-hand side of the slide, we've got a quote here from an education-focused academic, participant 3 from round 1, and he, again, is responding to my question about how did you get into academia? And he says, I chose my degree at 19 because I liked being at school. I was good at English, and I figured I'd get paid to be clever for a couple of hours a day and read lots of books. Interestingly, if we go to the right-hand side of the slide, we've got another education-focused academic, participant 3, this time from round 2. And I think that in their account here, they're taking this idea of the individual and applying it to a group, but there's also a sense of them standing back a little bit from that group. So they say academics can idealize their own view of themselves as students, thinking that they worked harder, understood the first time, and read all the books. So this is sort of some of the data that I see as kind of making up life of the mind. One of the kind of questions that I was really interested in this study was how might life of the mind ideology shape one's approach to teaching and to students? So I'm kind of putting that question to you. So we've looked at the data, we've looked at what the ideology is. How might that play out in relation to students and to teaching?
Good question. Can you go back to the previous slide, just so we've got it there to see?
I'm noticing typos. I'm so sorry. Is
there something about the kind of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation here?
Yeah. Yes, I would say so.
The bottom quote on the right, the academic elitism, the we, this idea of us as being students, I haven't thought about that. But I think, is it this idea that, can you say a bit more about what you mean about us as students?
So, I think it might be worth kind of showing you what I'm talking about, in fact. So I came to see, well, this is my interpretation. I think that what happens here is that these ideologies set up a form of hidden curriculum. And essentially it doesn't just tell academics how to think about themselves as a group, but it also then sets up expectations of how students should also behave and think and what values students should have coming into higher education. And I think that when these values or when these expectations are not met, then that can also create an emotional response to students. So I've got a couple of examples here of this. So in the first one, I think this kind of speaks to how life of the mind kind of sets up these expectations. So we've got participant 31 from round one. I like to see them having intrinsic motivation, a genuine desire to pick the ball up. I'm doing this for the grade versus I'm doing this because I'm enjoying the process of learning. So there's this idea that students should have this intrinsic motivation. And I think my word of caution here would just be that in a very diverse sector, students will have lots of different reasons for being in the classroom, and they might not be around disciplinary love. They might not be around kind of love of learning. It might be quite extractive. It might be, I need this qualification. And I think that should be perfectly legitimate within the particular context of higher education at the moment, given that sort of neoliberal framing and the massification of higher education. And I think what this can do sometimes is, and again, this doesn't happen with all of the participants, but sometimes I think this then can create frustrations with students. So we've got participant 5 here from round 1. I've had some fantastic Teams meetings in the past week with students from all over the world. They've engaged deeply with the module I'm teaching, and we've had really stimulating discussions. But there are also students who are there focused solely on what's going to be in the exam or how to get a certain grade. And that can make teaching quite frustrating. I don't know. What do you guys think about this?
Daniel, and then Katie.
Yeah, hi folks. Sorry, my video's not on. Let me just.
I can't see you anyway.
No. Okay. All right. Perhaps that's on. Thanks, Jenny. Really, really interesting so far. Yeah, see that chimes a little bit. So I'm Daniel. I'm from Plymouth Marge. I'm down in Devon. So I teach and I work in speech and language therapy. So really similar to something like nursing or teaching, in that it's kind of quite a vocational subject. And I often see, I think, with colleagues all over the place, this. I think what you're talking about there are kind of what the lecturer is bringing. And bringing all sorts of different expectations about. Sorry, what am I trying to say here? So it's a really broad topic, and so I think definitely students will be differently interested in different bits of that topic, or doing it for, the reason of I just want to be there at the other end. I don't necessarily enjoy all aspects of this. That's really resonating with me.
I think it's fine for us to have these sort of expectations of ourselves. And as I say, many of them are really positive. We're all here because we love doing what we love, what we do. I just think it's something we've got to be a bit more consciously aware of sometimes, that doesn't necessarily extend into the student domain, not all the time. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing a bad job or that they're doing a bad job. It's just different expectations of what this is all about, I think. Okay, thank you for that. That was really helpful, Daniel. It's nice to hear how other people see this as well. Okay, so let's have a little look at another prestige ideology.
Hang on a sec, Jenny. Can I just see if Katie wanted to come in?
Yeah, oh gosh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. There's one other hand up. Do you want to come in, Katie, or not?
Sorry, I was just trying to sort out unmuting on Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see a lot of this, this idea that, well, when I was a student, I would go and read X, Y, and Z, and I went off and did this thing, and, that kind of love of learning and, back in my day sort of approach. And occasionally I can kind of also find myself falling into that a little bit. Why aren't they so motivated by this? And isn't this like fascinating? But yeah, it's I think it's, like you say, realizing that the reasons that students are coming to university are changing, and the landscape is changing, and kind of how we shift or our expectations of students, and what do we really want from students. Yeah, that was just a ramble, but yeah.
Thank you. No, it wasn't a ramble. Thank you.
Jamie, do you want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to say that actually the point you raised is really interesting. I think we need to really be careful what we project onto the students. And I think we also need to be really careful about our own retrospective memory bias. And I will share a quick anecdote, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
So I'm a convener of a statistics module. And like Katie said, sometimes I find myself slipping into the same pattern of thinking, I wish the students would be engaged beyond the exam. Or, I think when I was an undergraduate, I was much more interested in this kind of stuff. And I was applying for a professional body, so I had to root out my grade transcripts from my undergraduate studies. And I actually saw a very modest statistics grade. And every time I fall into that way of thinking, I remind myself of my pretty modest statistics grade, and I think, okay, actually, I'm being a little bit elitist here.
Thank you. That was a really good kind of, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I do find it myself. I think in conversation with colleagues in my own department, we also do this. I think it's very natural because we love what we do so much. Is there anybody else, Louise, or should I move on to the next bit?
I think you can move on. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so the next prestige ideology that we kind of looked at slightly before was the dominance of the discipline. So just as a reminder, the doctrine of expertise and the knowledge production ideology are the two elements of this. And so I'm just going to read these quotes here because these are, again, sort of representative, I think, of what makes up this ideology. So the doctrine of expertise, a belief that the most valuable form of knowledge is a deep specialism and a form of academic legitimacy and security. So we've got an education-focused participant here from round one, and they're talking a little bit. So I asked them about their early career, and they were talking about their successes that they had in their early career. And so they attribute this to their very niche disciplinary knowledge. So he says, there's few people working in my specialism. So I think partly that's why I did so well, because they could never question that aspect of my knowledge, which I found quite intriguing, quite interesting. So there's sort of a security there around being an expert. So yeah, that's one part of this. We've also got knowledge production ideology, the belief that the most legitimate form of academic labour is generating new knowledge through research. So we've got two examples here. One is kind of within the context of a discussion about academic identity, and the other is within the context of a discussion about the purpose of higher education. So the first one here is about identity. It's participant 23 from round one. And they say, research is tied to my sense of identity as an academic. I think I'd feel like I wasn't a proper academic if I wasn't doing some research. And then I think this second quote here is quite telling. So it's from an education-focused participant one from round one. Research is the primary function of a university, to produce knowledge, isn't it? I know I'm kind of putting the inflection there, but within the context of the discussion that I had, it was really a rhetorical question. Read it as a statement. This person was saying research is the primary function of the university. So these are some of the data items that are attached to or kind of make up the dominance of the discipline. And again, I keep coming back to how do these ideologies relate to academic identity and to educator identity. Do you want to have a think about that, or shall I go on and share what I've got, and then we can have a discussion like we did just now?
I've just got one comment actually, as you were presenting that last bit. Why can't we research teaching? That doesn't seem to be seen as kind of a legitimate form of research, but actually that's what teaching academics can do, or education-focused academics try to understand. How can we better teach and support students to learn?
I think this is my take on that. And I haven't got any data here to sort of back up what I'm saying, but and it's not something I specifically looked at in this study, but my sense from the data is that it comes down to whether or not people see education as a thing, as an entity in and of itself. There are lots of discussions around whether or not education is a discipline. And I think if we can't create a sort of conceptual frame around education and it have the status of a discipline, then it becomes quite difficult to sort of quantify what that research is and where it might belong, and how do we think about this. So I think it's partly to do with education, and also those who do educational work, education-focused colleagues, I think are often sort of dissipated in an institution. So you'll have one education-focused colleague amongst lots of people who are doing disciplinary research. And so it's quite difficult for people to congregate around education as a thing, as an entity. And I think that might be partly where this issue lies. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's exactly what I found in my own institution, and why I then set up a network for those academics to get them together. Because even among my own PhD students, they were kind of situated within different disciplines, but they're all doing higher education focused research. So it's a case of kind of bringing them together into a almost like a non-discipline specific educational scholarship research hub.
Yes.
Which otherwise doesn't exist.
I think this kind of speaks to the broader kind of thing that I was talking about earlier around ideologies that challenge the teaching research hierarchy. I think it's only possible for things to change if there's a collective sense of identity. And so maybe that could be, I don't know, this is not going to be popular amongst everybody, maybe around subtle, maybe we could call it educational research, I don't know, but I think there needs to be more collecting of people in order to raise the status of this type of research, would be my take on this.
Yeah, exactly. Blessing and then Jackie. And just so you know, Jenny, we're 8 minutes to.
We're not going to finish. Nowhere near. I'm so sorry.
Maybe we need a part B.
I'd be more than happy to do that.
Thank you. Go on, Blessing.
Thank you. And I think, Louise, you echoed my thoughts exactly. In my mind, the question that was going was, where does education-focused research sit within that framing of knowledge production? Because ultimately it is knowledge production. And particularly, so I don't know whether there's following work to be done to really look at how that research is understood, how it is perceived, how it is judged, against the backdrop of discipline-specific research. And I think to further complicate the picture, how do we kind of treat that education-focused research that, merges the education and the discipline, focused angles, because there's a lot of that going on as well. I mean, I've come across a lot of work that is taking psychological theories and applying them to also all manner of topics, in terms of looking at higher education research, etc. So, yeah, I think it baffles me more than anything why, why the Institute of Higher Education does not consider this to be legitimate knowledge production when it is.
It's quite interesting within the data. So I sort of, as I mentioned, I've sort of done other studies as well as this within the PhD. So what was quite interesting when I looked specifically at education-focused identity development, amongst some within, and it was quite a small subsample, so we're talking 17. I would like to expand that in coming years, but that was the sample I had. So within that group of 17, amongst some, there was a complete rejection of subtle educational kind of research being part of their identity. They didn't want that. Instead, they wanted to devote what scholarship time they had to disciplinary research, which I thought was quite interesting. So it's not a universally accepted thing amongst education-focused academics that it should be part of one's identity. And I think the other part is that in the SOTL literature, in the discussion around SOTL, there is quite a lot written about the perceived status of SOTL and reasons why that is the way it is. So yeah, but this is definitely a question that could do with more unpacking for sure.
Jackie.
Okay.
Hi. Yeah, no, just kind of following on. I was just kind of wondering if there's anything in the kind of, if you're kind of researching within your discipline, you also probably do some teaching as well. Therefore, you perhaps see yourself as an expert in education, and so you kind of don't put that value on education as a discipline. I'm kind of doing some work. I'm an Ed.D. Student as well as kind of teaching, and my kind of area of research is around belonging, and it's something that everybody knows something about, and people are, within my institution, are not shy in coming and telling me what they know better than me about this particular area of research that they've maybe read one paper on. There's definitely something in that, I think.
Oh yes, so this is, we're not going to have time, but had we had time, this comes out very much in this project, in the subordinate ideologies under knowledge hierarchies, discipline over education. And I think sort of what kind of comes out in this ideology is that it's almost like the discipline is an echo chamber. And because everybody puts so much energy, time, thought into these communities, the most prototypical members of those communities are the ones that are trusted and valued to provide information and support around learning to teach. But what happens because of that is that there's sort of an armor around the discipline, and that if you've got an education focused staff member or somebody who's like an expert in teaching and learning or a staff developer, they don't want to be listened. They're not listened to because they're not trusted, because they're not prototypical members of that disciplinary community. So yeah, this definitely also comes out in this project as well, and it's a problem, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's fascinating. Thank you.
Louise, I think potentially, as we've probably not got very much time left, it might be worth just to sort of, I don't know, have an overall discussion. I'd love to come back and talk about the rest of it if that were a possibility. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing for now and find you all again.
There you go. Can you see us now?
There we go. Can you? I'm not sharing my screen anymore, am I?
No, that's fine. Perfect.
Okay.
I mean, one thing that actually, something you were saying earlier that I've never kind of thought about this explicitly, but you kind of almost brought to the fore something that maybe I've done kind of not necessarily deliberately, but as a psychologist and then coming into education work, I've kind of brought the psychology theories and methods into it, almost because I felt like that would give what I'm doing more credibility within a psychology discipline research, where research is, you know, I think it's perceived as more prestigious. And so I guess within my discipline, I kind of tried to merge the two. And maybe that's the way of trying to raise the status almost of what I'm doing.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think, oh, thanks, Paula. See you later. Yeah, I think that certainly, so in the slide about the subordinate ideologies there, the second participant, 34, was a historian, and he says basically that on the PG CAP course that he was doing, he was asked to read particular pieces of scholarship, and he kind of says they were very bad social sciences. And then he sort of goes on to say, the reason for this, as an empiricist, it's part of my job to judge standards of evidence. And, you know, I teach my students this. And so, you know, when the course instructors gave me this research to look at, I didn't want to engage in it anymore because it was just all rubbish. But the problem is education as a field has traditions. One of the traditions is the practical knowledge tradition. And so it's acknowledged that we create knowledge about learning and teaching through personal experience, through contextual kind of action research projects and so on. And this is an established way of creating knowledge about teaching. So it's quite interesting. Like, I think there's something there about which epistemologies are kind of most prized. Is that positivist sort of way of looking at the world maybe quite prized over maybe more qualitative approaches? I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Thank you so much, Jenny. We're going to have to draw it to a close because we're out of time. I'm just going to stop.